You probably picture Napoleon Bonaparte on a majestic horse, hand tucked into his coat, conquering Europe with cannonballs and cavalry charges. But what if I told you the history books sold you a half-truth? The real conquest, the one that truly built an empire, was not fought with steel, but with signatures, seal wax, and meticulously balanced spreadsheets. It turns out the pen is mightier than the sword, especially when it is writing checks. Behind the deafening roar of artillery, a much quieter, more powerful machine was at work. This machine was run by an army of treasury officials, notaries, bankers, and clerks. They moved numbers with the same strategic precision that generals moved regiments. The image of the battlefield genius is irresistible, of course. We love stories of improbable victory and daring marches. But the unglamorous truth is that Napoleon's empire rose because he completely rewired the financial plumbing of France. He understood a fundamental principle that eluded most rulers before him. A state might outfight its enemies for a season, but it can only outlast them if it can outfinance them. This is the story you were never taught in school. The tale of how a young man from Corsica inherited a nation on the brink of financial collapse and forged a system robust enough to fuel 15 years of relentless war, sweeping legal reform, and widespread modernization. Let us set the scene. France at the close of the 18th century was, to put it mildly, a financial dumpster fire dressed in elegant silk. The monarchy had quite literally spent itself into oblivion. For decades, kings had borrowed recklessly to fund extravagant wars and even more extravagant court luxuries. Their solution: a tax system that conveniently exempted the wealthiest nobles and clergy while squeezing every last drop from the common people. It was a masterclass in how not to run a country. When the revolution finally detonated in 1789, it shattered the political structure, but it could not erase the national debt. The new government, desperate for a quick fix, started printing paper money called assignats. These were supposedly backed by land confiscated from the church. For a moment, it felt like magic, liquidity without consequence. But that magic soon turned into a curse of hyperinflation. By the mid-1790s, prices were skyrocketing, public trust had evaporated, and the economy was choking. France had a revolutionary vision, but it had no monetary spine. Into this whirlwind of chaos steps a 29-year-old Napoleon Bonaparte in 1799, assuming the title of first consul. He was a soldier by trade, but a brilliant systems architect by instinct. He saw with perfect clarity what needed to come first: credibility. Before you can reliably command an army, you must command a currency. So he did something that seemed almost counter-revolutionary at the time. He created a bank. This was not the old, crony-filled piggy bank of the monarchy. In 1800, he chartered the Banque de France, a hybrid institution designed to serve both the stability of the state and the vitality of the economy. Private investors provided the capital, while the state provided direction and privileges. This mix was a deliberate stroke of genius. A purely public bank risked falling prey to political whims and the temptation of the printing press, while a purely private one could become a tool for a wealthy oligarchy. The message was clear: your money is now safe, and your wages will actually be worth something. Of course, confidence needs more than just a new building. It needs solid anchors. Napoleon provided two. First, he transformed the treasury into a highly professional and disciplined organization, appointing the quiet but brilliant Nicolas Francois Malian to run it. Cash flows were centralized, accounts were audited, and the state finally stopped improvising its finances. Second, and perhaps more importantly, he gave France a new currency with a measurable soul. In 1803, the franc germinal was introduced, its value fixed against specific weights of silver and gold. This was a financial masterstroke and a new social contract. But a stable currency is only as strong as the tax revenue that supports it. Napoleon knew the old system of farming out tax collection to private contractors was a recipe for corruption and public rage. So he abolished it. From now on, the The state would collect its own revenue. He established four main pillars of taxation, enforced by professional inspectors who carried notebooks instead of expecting backhanders. Detailed land registries, or cadasters, were created to ensure assessments were based on measured reality, not negotiated influence. He even created a Supreme Audit Court in 1807 to watch over public money with the same hawk-like intensity he used to watch a battlefield. With France's financial house now in order, Napoleon turned to the defining challenge of his era: funding continuous warfare without bankrupting the nation. And here is where his thinking was truly modern. He treated war like a cash-flowing enterprise. A victorious campaign was not just a strategic triumph, it was a revenue event. Defeated nations were handed a hefty bill in the form of indemnities. He requisitioned grain, horses, and metals, booking them as assets. The empire became a self-funding machine, a brilliant and brutal business model that worked perfectly, as long as it kept winning. He was relentless in finding new revenue streams. In 1803, he sold the entire Louisiana territory to the United States for $15 million. To him, cash in hand and denying the British a foothold was far more valuable than a distant colony he could not possibly defend. He turned administrative chaos in conquered lands into taxable order, imposing his legal code and restoring customs duties. The empire's economy was never an afterthought. It was always the second front of every war. But every system, no matter how brilliantly designed, eventually faces a stress test. For Napoleon, that test was the one thing he could not command: the sea. In 1806, he launched the Continental System, a massive economic blockade designed to cripple Great Britain by closing all European ports to its goods. On paper, it was a brilliant strategic move. In reality, it was an economic own goal. Do you know what happens when you try to ban things people want? Smuggling becomes the hottest new industry. The blockade ended up bleeding his own allies and fueling widespread resentment. Britain, ever resourceful, simply rerouted its trade and innovated its way through the storm. Harbors that once thrived under French control fell silent. The economic weapon designed to suffocate his greatest enemy began to bruise his own empire. This is a timeless lesson. You can use coercion to enforce a policy, but you cannot use it to permanently replace the laws of economics. Markets will always find the cracks. For a while, dazzling military victories managed to paper over the growing economic cracks. The triumph at Austerlitz paid the bills for a year. The victory at Wagram bought another. But the relentless arithmetic of war was turning against him. The moment of truth arrived with the unforgiving Russian winter of 1812. The campaign was not merely a military catastrophe. It was a balance sheet apocalypse. The thousands of lost soldiers and horses were not just casualties. They were the treasury's most expensive assets, trained and maintained for a decade, now erased from the books. The entire war pays for itself model collapsed overnight. Instead of the front lines funding the empire, the imperial center had to drain itself to rebuild what the ice and snow had destroyed. Even the most efficiently run treasury in the world cannot fund a war that consumes resources faster than any tax code can possibly replenish them. Credit markets dried up. The financial engine began to sputter and fail. And yet, here is the most essential part of the story. When Paris finally fell in 1814 and the emperor was exiled, the financial edifice he built did not crumble with him. The Banque de France remained. The franc germinal stood firm. The audit court kept counting, and the tax collectors kept walking their routes. Napoleon had given France a modern financial spine. He proved that law, money, and administration, when fused together, create a durable engine of state that can outlast the person who built it. When you look closer, his era reads like a user manual for the modern nation-state. A central bank mixing public aims with private capital. A stable currency that people can trust. A tax system that is broad and professionally collected. And a sober recognition that war is ultimately a financial enterprise that can bankrupt even the strongest if not managed with brutal realism. The empire was extraordinary precisely because its components were so rational and, in hindsight, so ordinary. But if you stop the story there, you miss the critical warning embedded in his triumph. Any system built on the assumption of constant growth or external revenue, whether from conquered nations or from today's rolling deficits, shares the same hidden risk. It conditions a state to need constant momentum. Then the shock comes: a war, a recession, a global crisis. Suddenly, the engine cannot sustain the load. This is when governments reach for the same old tools, hoping that confidence alone will save them. Sometimes it does. Sometimes it does not. The outlines of Napoleon's financial state are the default operating system for almost every major nation today. Every finance minister knows that currency credibility, competent tax administration, and predictable laws are what truly attract investment, not patriotic slogans. And every government tempted by endless spending or forever wars eventually runs into the same unmovable wall. Mathematics, public patience, and trust all have their limits. So what is the takeaway for you? First, that understanding finance is not a hobby, it is a vital part of citizenship. Economic history is not about dusty dates. It is a guide to recognizing how power truly works. Second, durable wealth is built on solid structures, not on speculative bubbles. Napoleon's lasting legacy came from things people could trust: stable money, fair taxes, and reliable courts. The illusions, like the fantasy that victory is a permanent revenue stream, all cracked under pressure. Ultimately, money and power are inseparable. Napoleon understood that coins and cannonballs serve the same master: national strategy. When the financial system serves the plan, you can move mountains. When the plan ignores the limits of the financial system, the mountain slides right back on top of you. If you want to keep that final image in your mind, picture a ledger lying open next to a map. Napoleon spent his life obsessed with both. When the columns in the book and the contours on the map aligned, he was invincible. When they did not, defeat was already on the march. History has the answers, if you know where to look. If this gave you a new perspective, make sure you subscribe for more.